8 months into the economic crisis, as well as the health crisis, of course, that comes from the COVID-19 disease, questions are asked what the effects of this crisis will be on economics. And although it is far too soon to come to conclusive statements, there is some initial evidence that I would like to share with you. Let's first plot the changes in GDP from one year to the next, so in gross domestic product, over the past 3 decades. So if you look at this, these three lines, and they pretty much, there's differences between them, but they all go in the same direction. So let's not focus on the different lines, but just on the overall pattern. And let's add a line at 0, which implies no change to this graph. Then we see that up to 2010, the economic development around the world was positive. Every year, people were able to consume more than was the case in the year before. Then in 2010, the credit crisis arose, or just before that, it started to have its economic implications in 2010, and that was since before 1980, the first point where actually the world economy shrunk. Now, at 2020, that's where the line ends, and we see that we're even below the lowest point of 2010. So this is an economic crisis that is unprecedented in recent history. It's a health crisis that is unprecedented, but it's also an economic crisis. As we've seen before, graphs like these mask underlying variation, and there's underlying variation of two sorts. First, we throw all countries on one big pile and then see to the development of these countries as a group. And of course, one country may have an entirely different history of economic development than another. That's what the next slide will be about. Also, within countries, certain groups may have benefited from economic development while others stayed behind. So even though we come to the conclusion that a country as a whole experienced decent progress, that is not to say that everyone in that country suffered, nor the reverse. If a country goes in a depression, then there may be groups in society that benefited still. So what I now will share with you is another IMF source. So the monetary source. This is the world map with colored countries. So you see, depending on the color of the country, the economic fate that the country had in a particular year. So countries depicted in red are those which had severe economic trouble, but there's also other colors that you can look at. And what I will now do, there's a slider on the bottom. I will go from 2010 to 2020, and then you will see different countries lining up. Let's see how that unfolds. This is 2010. Then we go to 2011, and we see that there's African countries who went into depression. The Middle East lights up as there was a Middle East conflict. And there's the Ukraine. There's all political struggles, particularly leading to issues. But then in 2020, suddenly bang, the entire world. So that this shows that economic downturns in the period 2010 to 2019 were pretty local, or at least at the national level. There's conflicts in the Middle East, conflicts in Africa, health crises in Africa also, Eastern European struggles, also some in Latin America, and they lead to downturns in a specific country in a specific year. It's not rare that in the year thereafter the country already recovers from the downturn. But now, in 2020, we see that all countries across the globe have experienced a growth of less than -3%. So the economy decreases by more than 3%. This again shows that there's, as we saw in the first graph, a positive trend. There's underlying variation, so not all countries experience this growth. Similarly, if you were in the Middle East, there were years where things went really bad economically, for example, but also Brazil lighted up in 1 year. But 2020 is really a different year, as all countries are in decline in this year. Okay, then let's look forward a bit. Now, that's always tricky, but this is what the OECD currently predicts. So the top line is the 2019 forecast. That is the forecast of economic development from the second quarter of 2020 onwards until 2022. And we see it starts at 100. That's because it's been normalized to start at 100. And then the projection was that the economic development would go into around 108. So that's an 8% positive development of the economies from 2020 to 2022. Now we see the sharply decreasing line that is the real development, and that's of course where the COVID crisis hit hard, and the economy actually went from 100 to 90. So it's a decrease of 10%. And then we're here, it says. So we have recovered somewhat. The world has recovered somewhat, and there's from that point onwards, from the we are here point onwards, that is the fourth quartile of 2020, there are different scenarios, an upside scenario, a current forecast, and a downside scenario that depend on particularly how long the crisis will stay, the health crisis will stay, and whether vaccines will become available. And depending on that, we see that the prospects are better or still worse than they are currently. The main conclusion first is that likely none of these forecasts will turn out to be real, as is often the case, but we see that even the most positive upside scenario implies a longer term lagging behind of economic development as compared to the November 2019 predictions. So the prediction is that the economy will end up at a level of development that is structurally below the level that we thought we would have before we could even imagine something like this crisis happening. Hence, some intermediate conclusions. The current crisis is unprecedented in recent history, and the effect of the pandemic varies between countries and likely also within a country. Now, countries responded differently, also because they were affected differently to the economic crises resulting from the health crisis. And they responded to the health crisis in different ways. Some went into severe lockdowns, others had lighter measures, others were also struck at a later point in time. And it is far too early to make any statements to come to reach a conclusion about the effects of these lockdowns, but there are some initial studies that show the mechanisms that are at play here. And so it's still, even though the conclusions of these studies may not stand in the end, it's still interesting to attend to the different mechanisms. So there's a simulation study of Japan, where they went when they engage in an effort, and they is, and I wrote that down, Inu and Turu. My Japanese isn't that good. They studied the effect of a theoretical lockdown on the Japanese economy, and they thought what would happen to the economy if Tokyo goes into a lockdown, and what they hypothesized or what they observed is that there will be two effects, and they both come from the integration of supply chains. So many firms source products from firms outside a particular region. Here, the Tokyo region was taken as the example, the big 37 million inhabitants Tokyo region, where a lot of products are bought from outside the wider Tokyo area. But you can extrapolate this to, for example, a German firm that buys inputs from Italy and then sells in the Polish market. There are both upstream and downstream negative effects to be expected from a lockdown. First, there are downstream effects since consumers will not buy products anymore. So the demand for a particular product decreases. And as we will see later on, demand may also increase. Firms then need to adjust their production to meet the new standards. And consumers who are in lockdown demand less of a particular product. There are also upstream effects because a firm that used to buy inputs from an area that is now in lockdown can no longer do so if business in that area would be closed. And what these two authors, Inoue and Todo, did, they studied the direct and the indirect effect of a lockdown in Tokyo on other regions in Japan. And what they figured out is that a one-day lockdown has an effect of 309 billion yen, that's approximately 290 US dollars, directly on Tokyo, and an indirect effect that is almost that's quite similar. So it's around 80% of the direct effect on regions outside Japan. And the longer the lockdown would last, the bigger the effect would be on regions outside of Japan. And the reason may be that initially, when firms can no longer source from Tokyo-based enterprises, and they still have some inventories left, and they can use their stocks of products to still continue the production. But at some point, the inventories will dry up. And a firm, even if it is in a region where there's no lockdown at all, will still need to adjust its production levels downwards because it can no longer buy the inputs that it needs for its production process. And in the end, you see that a 2-month lockdown has a direct effect of roughly 16 billion US dollars, 18.6 billion trillion yen, but 3 times as much almost indirectly on regions outside Japan. And this is a simulation, so again, it's not to say that that this is realistic, but it does show that because of the integration of economies and firms across the globe, an effect that happens, a lockdown that happens in a particular region, spreads like a virus almost to other regions in the world and may have severe consequences there. So even if, for example, Asia would be able to effectively combat the COVID virus, then still it may suffer because other countries are not able to do so. Interestingly, Tokyo has not gone into a lockdown effectively. Its population is relatively old. It's a densely populated country. So you would, with densely populated cities, so you would expect that this is the ideal context for a virus to spread. Right? People are packed in cities and are relatively old, so the effects of infection should be bigger. But surprisingly, the number of infections in Japan have been relatively low, and so a lockdown has never been enforced. There have been suggestions to close shops. Okay, so let's go from simulations to initial immediate effects. And this graph studies another mechanism that is relevant. This is a study that is Goolsbee and Syverson's US data, and they looked at the effect of lockdown measures on movement data. So how much will people move from one region to the other to do their shopping, for example. Now the vertical line indicates the point at which some counties went into a lockdown. And before that lockdown and after, you see the effect of the effect on the number of visits to shops. And now the two lines, they represent two different groups of counties. First, there are so-called SIP counties. These are counties in which a lockdown was in place. And there are similar commuting zones. So these are counties that are similar to the ones that went into a lockdown but then didn't. And the striking difference is that the graphs pretty much coincide. So whether or not a county went into a lockdown, the effect on business transactions is quite similar. They quantified this effect and said that on average, business transactions were reduced by 60%. So the number of visits to shops were reduced to 60%, and only 7 percentage point of that, so 7 out of 60, could be attributed to restrictions in mobility. So governments may consider organizing lockdowns to reduce the spread of the virus, but we already see a sharp decrease in business that anticipates lockdown. So people's fear for infection in this case already hurts the business. And that is why some argue that governments might as well implement severe lockdowns, because their incremental effect on the economy is relatively low, and they may have strong effects on the spreading of the virus because of even further reductions in mobility of consumers. All right, then finally, and there's some initial effects of Italian lockdowns. Or perhaps it's good to emphasize one other thing in the Goolsbee and Syverson example. This one. This also groups different industries in one. So this is the total of shop visits. And there's interesting differences if you look in subgroups. In particular, theaters, zoos, cinemas, bowling centers were strongly affected. So visits to those outlets were sharply reduced. Essentially, the entertainment industry. Less affected were pharmacies, convenience stores, supermarkets, showing that some basic goods we still need to go out to get these. That makes sense. But we also see changes in patterns of consumption. For example, hardware stores and caterers were also less affected. So rather than going to a restaurant, people have their meals delivered at home. Hardware stores, presumably people start to buy equipment to be able to work from home. And finally, we see that there are three, maybe somewhat surprising industries that actually saw more visits beyond as a result of lockdown effects. These were golf courses. I don't know, well, perhaps people moved from cinemas, where they're relatively close, to golf courses to entertain themselves there, where social distancing is easier to implement. Garden centers, maybe a similar effect as the hardware stores. If you have to work from home, you'd like to plant a tree there because that's healthy, that's good to look at. You look after your physical environment more. And primarily the suppliers of outdoor power equipment. So apparently, and this may be a US thing, I don't know, apparently US citizens wanted to be self-sufficient in their power. And so they wanted to be able to generate their own electricity. Okay, so back to Italy. And as I said, there's initial evidence there, initial effects of an Italian lockdown. What the paper finds And I don't want to give any weight to the findings themselves, but rather to the message that they send, is that the effect is strongest in lower per capita income groups. So those who have lowest income suffer the most from the Italian lockdown, which was really a severe one. But also municipalities with relatively good fiscal starting positions seem to suffer the most. And the paper doesn't explain why. And I don't want to go into explanations because that also suggests that this is a strong and robust finding, which it may not be at all. But what it does show is that the effect of a lockdown on some groups is bigger than in others, and that it also varies on the context of the local economy in which the lockdown is implemented. So that leads to another set of kind of conclusions, or at least mechanisms that are highlighted for this video. First, the lockdown effect may be smaller than the anticipation effect of a lockdown. And more generally, we see that that if people start to anticipate economic measures, then then the measures themselves may not have that strong an effect anymore because people already started to behave as if the measures were in place. The effect spreads to regions not in lockdown. So if you try to do something about your own country's economic conditions, that may be tough if this is not coordinated across nations. And also, as long as the virus is there in some regions of the world, other regions will also experience the shocks of those regions, particularly if these countries are really integrated into the world economy, and thereby in the production processes of firms. And third, the effect differs per subgroup in the population and varies with the context in which it was implemented. In one region, the effect may be different than in the other, and one section of the population may suffer more than others, and some may even benefit. And that is suggestive of the effectiveness of differentiated measures.